On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia, carrying a briefcase bomb, placed it beneath a conference table, and left the room believing he had just set in motion the assassination that could break the Nazi regime from inside its own army. But Hitler survived the explosion.
Operation Valkyrie failed, and Hitler survived, which seems incredible when you see the pictures of the aftermath.
The coup in Berlin collapsed before the day was over, and by the early hours of the next morning, Stauffenberg was standing in the courtyard of the Bendler block with other conspirators, facing a firing squad for the act that made him one of the most famous resistance figures in German history. His death, however, was not enough for the Nazi leadership, because the regime that had survived the bomb now wanted revenge not only against the men who had planned it, but against the wives, children, brothers, cousins, and relatives who carried their names. So what happened to the family of the man who tried to kill Hitler? Why did the Nazis try to punish children for their father's failed assassination attempt? And how did the name they tried to erase survive into the Germany that came after the war? The answer begins in the hours after the bomb failed, when the Nazi state moved with the speed of a wounded animal that understood it had almost been killed from within. Stauffenberg had not been a foreign assassin or a captured enemy agent. He was a German aristocrat, a colonel in the army, a decorated officer who had lost an eye, a hand, and fingers in North Africa, and one of the men trusted enough to enter Hitler's headquarters during a military conference. That was what made the plot so dangerous to the regime. It showed that opposition had reached into the officer corps, into old families, into ministries, into the same institutions the Nazis had claimed to command absolutely. If Hitler could be nearly killed by a man in uniform standing only a few feet away from him, then the regime had to prove that betrayal would not end with one execution. The executions began almost immediately. Stauffenberg, Friedrich Olbricht, Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Werner von Haften were shot in the Bendler block courtyard during the night after the failed coup, while other conspirators were hunted, arrested, interrogated, tortured, and dragged before the People's Court in trials designed less to discover truth than to display humiliation before death. Klaus's older brother, Berthold von Stauffenberg, who had also been involved in the resistance network, was arrested and later executed, while Alexander von Stauffenberg, another brother who had not taken part in the plot, was arrested anyway while serving far from Berlin. Around the Stauffenberg name, the regime cast its net wider and wider, reaching toward uncles, cousins, in-laws, and relatives whose crime was not action but blood. The word behind this punishment was Sippenhaft, a German term for kinship liability, meaning that the family of a person accused of treason could be punished because of the supposed guilt of the bloodline. It was an old idea, but under the Nazis, it became a terror measure used against political enemies, and after July 20th, it became one of the clearest signs of how personally Hitler and Himmler took the attack. Himmler spoke openly of destroying the Stauffenberg family down to the last member, and even if the regime did not succeed in literally killing them all, it acted with the intention of breaking the family apart, taking its property, isolating its adults, and removing the children from the name their father had made famous. For Klaus's wife, Nina von Stauffenberg, the punishment began only days after she learned that her husband was dead. She was at Lautlingen, the family estate in southern Germany, pregnant with their fifth child and surrounded by 4 young children who could not possibly understand why their father's name had suddenly become dangerous. In the days after the failed plot, the Gestapo came for her, not as a widow who had lost her husband overnight, but as a source of information, a member of a suspect family, and the pregnant wife of the officer Hitler now hated as one of the central traitors of the Reich. She was taken away from her home and children and pulled into the machinery of interrogation, isolation, and transport that had already swallowed so many people connected to July 20th. The 4 children left behind were still very young. Berthold, the eldest, was 10. Heimeran was 8. Franz Ludwig was 6. Valerie was only 3. They were not conspirators, witnesses, or soldiers. They had not placed the bomb, attended the meetings, or chosen the code words that were supposed to set the coup in motion. Yet, in the logic of the Nazi state, after July 20th, they were no longer simply children. They were Stauffenbergs, and that meant the regime treated them as something to be controlled, renamed, and separated from the family that had produced the man who tried to kill Hitler. The children were taken to a children's home in Bad Saxe in the Harz region, where other children of resistance families were also held under state control. There, the erasure became practical and intimate. The name Stauffenberg was removed from them and replaced with the surname Meister, as if a different word on paper could sever them from their father, their mother, and the history that had suddenly fallen on their family. The children were cut off from normal contact with relatives, watched by adults who served the regime, and placed in a world where the facts of their own lives were being rewritten around them. For the older boys, there was enough understanding to know that something terrible had happened. For the youngest, the change was almost beyond explanation. This was not simply imprisonment in the usual sense. It was an attempt to interrupt inheritance itself. The Nazis understood that names carried memory, loyalty, and identity, and the Stauffenberg children carried a name that the regime wanted to turn into shame before they were old enough to defend it. Plans existed for what could happen if the war lasted longer. Younger children from families condemned under Sippenhaft could be placed with politically reliable families, while older boys could be sent into schools and institutions designed to shape them into servants of the state. Had Germany survived longer, the children of the man who tried to kill Hitler might have been scattered under false names and raised to belong to the same regime that executed their father. While her children were being held under another name, Nina was being moved through the prison system while her pregnancy advanced. She was taken to Berlin and questioned about what she had known, whom her husband had met, what had been said at home, and whether the wives of the conspirators had been part of the inner circle. She insisted she had not known the details of the plot, and whatever she did or did not know, she gave the Gestapo little that could satisfy its appetite. From there she was sent to Ravensbrück, the concentration camp north of Berlin, where she was kept in isolation, pregnant, separated from her children, and forced to carry the unborn child of an executed man through the same system that had already branded the family as guilty. By late 1944 and early 1945, Germany itself was breaking apart, but the collapse did not bring immediate safety to prisoners like Nina. The Red Army was moving toward the Oder. Allied forces were pressing into Germany from the west. Camps, prisons, and special detention sites began to shift and empty as the SS tried to move prisoners away from advancing armies, and the same chaos that made the regime weaker made its prisoners more vulnerable. A government that no longer had the strength to win the war still had the power to move people from cell to camp to transport, and for Nina, childbirth itself became something the state controlled. As her due date approached, she was transferred from Ravensbrück to a maternity facility in Frankfurt an der Oder, and on January 27, 1945, she gave birth to a daughter named Constanze. The child was born 7 months after her father had been shot in Berlin. Born into a family whose name the regime had tried to erase, and born under the custody of the state that had executed the man she would never meet. In another life, the birth of a 5th child might have been a family event, marked by letters, visitors, older siblings, and a father waiting somewhere nearby. In Nazi Germany in January 1945, it happened inside the world of prisons, guarded transfers, collapsing fronts, and a mother who still did not know when she would see her other children again. Mother and baby did not remain in one place for long. As the Soviet advance came closer, prisoners considered valuable by the SS were moved away from the front, and members of the wider Stauffenberg family were gathered with other kinship prisoners and prominent hostages. Some relatives were held at Buchenwald, separated from the main camp, and then moved south as the SS tried to keep hold of people who might be traded, used as bargaining pieces, or simply kept out of Allied hands until the last possible moment. The route carried prisoners through the dying geography of the Third Reich, where commands were collapsing, guards were frightened, and the people still in custody had to fear not only the journey, but what the SS might do if liberation came too close. In the final weeks of the war, Nina and her newborn daughter were among prisoners moved south toward the mountains of South Tyrol, while other Stauffenberg relatives and special prisoners were also dragged through the final movements of a regime trying to preserve leverage after it had lost the war. By then, Hitler was dead, Berlin was falling, and Germany's surrender was near, but none of that automatically saved the people in SS hands. Across the collapsing Reich, prisoners were still being shot, marched, abandoned, or used as hostages in the hope that some local commander could trade them for safety. For the Stauffenbergs, the danger did not end with the failure of the plot, or with Klaus's execution, or even with the obvious defeat of Nazi Germany. It lasted until armed Allied soldiers finally reached the places where the family had been scattered. When American troops freed the hostage groups in South Tyrol in May 1945, Nina was alive, holding the daughter she had carried through arrest, imprisonment, Ravensbrück, childbirth under guard, and evacuation through a collapsing empire. But freedom did not immediately make her a family again. Her husband was dead. Her brother-in-law Berthold had been executed. Other relatives had been imprisoned or displaced. Property had been seized. The country around her was in ruins. Most painfully, her 4 older children had spent the end of the war under another name in Bad Saxe, and Nina still had to find out where they were, what had been done to them, and whether the family the regime tried to split apart could still be put back together. The reunion came after Germany's surrender, when the children were recovered from Bad Saxe and brought back to their mother. For the first time since the arrests, Nina could stand with all 5 children in one place: Berthold, Heimeran, Franz Ludwig, Valerie, and the baby Constanze, who had been born while the others were still being held under the name Meister. The older children met a sister whose existence was tied to the months of imprisonment they had not seen. Constanze entered a family whose father was already a memory, whose name had been marked by both shame and sacrifice, and whose survival had depended partly on the fact that the Nazi state collapsed before its plans for the children could be completed. The Stauffenbergs had survived, but survival did not mean restoration. In the Germany that emerged after 1945, Claus von Stauffenberg was not immediately treated by everyone as the clean national hero he would later become. Many Germans still saw the July 20th conspirators as traitors, especially in the first post-war years, when defeat, occupation, hunger, and ruin made people argue over guilt in ways that were often bitter and defensive. To some, Stauffenberg had raised his hand against a criminal regime too late. To others, he had betrayed his oath as an officer. To others, he represented the possibility that some Germans had resisted Hitler from within, even if that resistance came after years of serving the same state they finally tried to destroy. Nina had to raise her children inside that argument. She did not return to an easy life of restored estates and public honor. The family's property and finances had been damaged by confiscation and war, and rebuilding took years. She eventually returned with the children to Bamberg, her home city, but not quickly, and not as a woman, stepping back into the life she had known before July 20th. She was a widow, raising 5 children in a defeated country, still deciding how to remember the man who had made those children fatherless. Her choice, by many accounts, was not to turn Claus into a saint inside the household. She kept his memory, but she allowed the children to grow into their own understanding of what he had done, what it had cost, and what the Nazi regime had tried to do to them because of it. The children's later lives showed how completely the Nazi plan had failed. The eldest son, Berthold Maria von Stauffenberg, had been a 10-year-old boy renamed Meister at Bad Saxe, stripped of his family name by the regime that killed his father. In 1956, when West Germany created the Bundeswehr, the new armed forces of the Federal Republic, he joined as an officer. He made the military his career, rose through the ranks, and eventually became a major general before retiring after decades of service. The son of a man shot for trying to overthrow the German state, built his adult life serving the democratic German state that replaced it, carrying the same name the Nazis had tried to remove from him as a child. Franz Ludwig, who had been 6 years old when the family was broken apart, carried the name into politics. He became a lawyer, entered public life through the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, served in the West German Parliament, and later sat in the European Parliament. His life placed the Stauffenberg name not in hiding, but inside the political institutions of post-war democracy, the very kind of public life the Nazis had tried to prevent by treating bloodlines as political threats. He also became involved in the public argument over how July 20th should be remembered, because for the children of Stauffenberg, memory was not an abstract national ceremony. It was the story of their father, their childhood, and the name that had been taken from them. The other children lived more private or quieter lives, though not all of them long. Heimeren stayed largely outside the public struggle over his father's legacy. Valerie, the youngest of the 4 children taken to Bad Saxe, died of leukemia in the 1960s while still a young woman. Constanze, the child born in captivity, later lived in Switzerland and eventually gave her mother the written voice Nina had never claimed for herself, publishing a biography of Nina decades after the war. In that sense, the baby born under guard in January 1945 became one of the people who preserved the memory of the woman who had carried the family through imprisonment, separation, widowhood, and the long aftermath of a failed attempt to kill Hitler. Nina lived long enough to see the name transformed. She died in 2006 at the age of 92, more than 60 years after the regime had tried to break her family apart. By then, Claus von Stauffenberg's name had been placed on streets, remembered in ceremonies, connected to barracks, studied in schools, and tied to the Bendler Block courtyard where he had been shot. The same Germany that once called him a traitor now used his story as part of its memory of resistance, though that memory remained complicated because Stauffenberg had been both a soldier of the German army and the man who finally turned his weapon toward Hitler. What happened to his family after the war was therefore not simply survival in the biological sense. It was the survival of a name through a deliberate attempt to erase it. The Nazis killed Claus von Stauffenberg, executed his brother, arrested relatives who had never placed a bomb, imprisoned his pregnant wife, renamed his children, and tried to control what those children would become. For a few months in 1944 and 1945, the regime still had enough power to scatter the family across homes, prisons, camps, and hostage transports. But it did not have enough time left to finish what it had started. The family of the man who tried to kill Hitler came out of the war wounded, scattered, fatherless, and marked by a name that carried danger before it carried honor. Yet the children grew up under that name again. One served in the new German army. One served in democratic politics. One preserved the memory of the mother who had survived captivity while carrying the last child of the condemned man. The name the Nazis tried to erase outlived the regime that tried to erase it, not as a clean story without pain, but as one of the clearest reminders that Nazi revenge reached far beyond the men who acted against Hitler, and that even children were not spared when the dictatorship felt itself threatened. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.